It's all yours, Ross.
Thank you, Scott. So Scott and I have been working on this Know Thy Neighbor lecture series for Marian Friends Meeting for over 2 years now. And it was the sort of the brainchild of how can we do a little more outreach for Marian Friends Meeting as we were starting our capital campaign to raise $90,000 to do a preservation plan for the entire campus. So Marian Friends Meeting was built in, the meeting house was built in 1695. Well, actually, construction began in 1695, but because they were early Welsh farmers, they could probably only work on the weekends or during the winter. So it took until 1715 for the building to be totally completed. But our campus also, it's a National Historic Landmark. Our campus also holds 2 horse and carriage sheds from the 1820s. There's an 1682 burial ground, which is when the meeting was founded. There is an 1804 caretaker's house, and there is a relatively recent 1950 activities building, which now it's old enough to be considered historic as well. So we received a $25,000 grant from the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission Keystone planning grant, and that was a matching grant. And our overall project was $90,000, and we are only $5,000 away from our goal. So one of the things I would like to do is to ask if anybody is so moved to take a look at our website, and there are ways that you can make a donation and support our mission online. We've had a series of very interesting speakers. We have expanded the theme from historic preservation and history to include topics of social justice, and Laura Jackson, one of our members, has been kind enough to fulfill our search for other speakers on the social justice area. And our next speaker that she just told me about is George Lakey, and he has a new book out called Dancing with History, and it'll be released on November 15th, which will be right before his talk with us on November 27th. So mark your calendars for that. But I'm very pleased to introduce Paul Steinke. I've known Paul for a number of years. Paul is the executive director of the Preservation Alliance for Greater Philadelphia, and they are a membership-based organization whose mission is to promote the appreciation and adaptive reuse and development of the Philadelphia region's historic buildings, communities, and landscapes. He started on his role there in 2016, and he served on the board of directors there for many years. Prior to that, Paul was the general manager of the Reading Terminal Market for 13 years, which I know he had his hands filled with that job. And earlier in his career, he was the founding executive director of the University City District, neighborhood improvement and revitalization organization in West Philadelphia. And he was the finance director for the Center City District prior to that. Paul is a lifelong Philadelphian. He holds a bachelor's degree in business administration and economics from Penn State University and an MBA from Drexel. He serves on as the board treasurer of the Fund for the Waterworks and serves on the board of directors of the National Preservation Partners Network, Temple University Libraries, and the City and State PA Advisory Board. He lives in Franklintown, where he just moved, I understand, with his husband and partner of 27 years, David Adey, an architect with a practice based in Philadelphia. Paul just had the Preservation Alliance's annual awards dinner at Glen Ford, where I serve as director. So we just saw each other on Thursday night, and so it's great to have him here with us again today. Welcome, Paul, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ross, for that introduction. And yes, indeed, we had a great event on Thursday evening at Glen Ford, thanks to Ross and his willingness to host us. We had beautiful weather and a wonderful occasion. I think at least a few of the people on this call today were able to join us that night. I am shown in the foyer of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, one of Philadelphia's most impressive, I think, historic buildings. This one designed by Frank Furness right there at Broad and Cherry Streets, and built in 1876, coinciding with the centennial of American independence. I see a few familiar names on my screen in front of me, so it's nice to see both those who I'm acquainted with and to have some new friends joining us this afternoon. And as Scott said, we're not only competing with the Eagles today, but we're competing with a beautiful early fall afternoon. And also the Phillies, dear to my heart, are playing meaningful September baseball for the first time in a decade. So thank you all for putting all of that aside, joining us here for an hour. And I hope I can impart some information that you find interesting and worthwhile. So I am going to start my screen here with my PowerPoint. Let's give me a moment to do that. And as Ross said, I am a lifelong Philadelphian, born and raised in the northeast part of the city. I lived for the past 24 years in University City, and just moved last month to the Franklintown neighborhood, also known as Logan Square. And that's where I'm living now. It's the Puerto Rican Day parade outside, so it's been a little noisy. But after the hurricane they just got through in Puerto Rico, I hope they have reason to celebrate the recovery today. All right, so let me go to the beginning of this talk. The screen here cooperates from the beginning. There we go. All right, hope you all can see that and hear me. So what I'm going to be doing today is, first I'll tell you a little bit about the Preservation Alliance for Greater Philadelphia. Ross gave you a brief overview. And then I'm going to go down through the centuries in less than an hour and give you the highlights of the historic preservation and movement in Philadelphia over the past 300 or so years. The Preservation Alliance was formed in 1996 out of the merger of two predecessor organizations you can see there. And that's why we're called the Preservation Alliance, because we truly are and were an alliance of two organizations that were founded in the late 70s and early 1980s. One of the things we do is we monitor the Philadelphia Historical Commission. And the Philadelphia Historical Commission is a city agency that was created in the 1950s as part of the city charter to regulate historic properties in Philadelphia. So they have several meetings a month, and we're always in attendance at them, participating, putting things on the agenda and commenting on items that are on the agenda. And some of the items that we participate in, that we drive, are nominations of properties to the Philadelphia Register of Historic Places, which is a list that the Philadelphia Historical Commission keeps. And they then regulate what happens with these properties, which cannot be demolished or altered without their consent. And the Philadelphia Register incorporates somewhere between 12 and 13,000 properties on that list, which goes back to the 1950s. Some of our recent nominations are shown here. The Engine 11 Firehouse at 10th and South Streets in the upper left, which was the city's first primarily Black-run firehouse. Upper right is Hallahan School, a Catholic high school for girls that was just closed last year and threatened with demolition, but is now on the Philadelphia Register. And the Sigma Sound Studios, the location of where the Philadelphia Sound was recorded. Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff in the 70s and 80s, and other artists who recorded albums there like Billy Joel and David Bowie. And so it's a Philadelphia music landmark at 12th and Race Streets near the Convention Center. The Preservation Alliance holds almost 250 preservation easements. You probably heard of land conservation easements, where land is protected. This is the same idea, but for buildings, where a private property owner and an organization like the Preservation Alliance reach an agreement where properties must be maintained in perpetuity, and in exchange, the IRS will give the property owner a tax break, a one-time tax break, as long as the property is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So here's some examples you can see in this slide of buildings that we have on our list of easements, including the Bellevue, a recognizable building there in the center at Broad and Walnut. We give architecture walking tours during the warm weather months from April into November, every weekend, and some weekday nights. And the full list of tours is available on our website. We visit neighborhoods, we visit historic buildings. Often we'll go inside the buildings, but just as often we're doing neighborhood walking tours in different parts of the city. Our biggest event of the year is our annual Preservation Achievement Awards event, which takes place each June, in which we honor exemplary historic preservation and adaptive reuse projects from around the region. And we also honor exemplary individuals who have made significant contributions to the field. So we did that this past June. We honored the restoration of the Christ Church steeple, the restoration of the Smith Memorial Playhouse, the conversion of a former textile mill in Kensington to apartments, and the conversion of a former bank headquarters at Cotman and Castor in the Northeast into the headquarters of a social services agency. And that one in the lower right is an example of mid-century modern architecture that now is, as Ross hinted earlier, is getting to the age where it itself is being considered historic and worthy of preservation. We do a variety of digital programming, much like you're doing here today through Mary and Friends meeting. In fact, we're in the midst of our fall speaker series each Tuesday night and until November 1st. And this fall, we are focusing on the history of different Philadelphia neighborhoods. Last week, we had Chinatown. The week before that, we had University City. And this week, we have the neighborhood known as Eastwick in Southwest Philadelphia. So visit our website, preservationalliance.com, if you're interested in finding out more about the neighborhoods that we are featuring in the fall speaker series. We publish a print magazine 3 times a year called Extant that gets mailed to all members. And we have a robust Young Friends group, the Young Friends of the Preservation Alliance, who have a steering committee and who plan tours, events, and programming throughout the year.
I bet that felt good. Yeah, good boy. That's you a good boy. Would you like a treat?
Sounds like we have somebody who's gone off mute. All right, we fixed that. Thank you. And finally, we engage in policy development and reform with Philadelphia city government, to some degree with state and federal government as well, to improve city policies and regulations when it comes to development so that they're more conducive to historic preservation and less conducive to demolition. So let's go back in time and examine where the historic preservation movement in Philadelphia came from. And I think probably the best illustration is the slate roof house, which was built in 1687 or thereabouts, and served as the home of William Penn, a Quaker, of course, and his family while he was in Philadelphia in the late 17th century. Its threatened removal in the 19th century prompted one of the first coordinated, widespread efforts to preserve a historic structure in Philadelphia. The building was built by Samuel Carpenter, who was one of Philadelphia's largest landowners. It was Penn's home during his second visit to Philadelphia, and he and his family rented it for £80 per year. He lived there with his second wife, Hannah, their daughter, Letitia, and their son, John. And since he was there, it served as the de facto seat of the provincial government of the colony of Pennsylvania. After Penn left, it was lived in by James Logan until 1704. Then Samuel Carpenter sold it to William Trent, the founder of Trenton. As you can see, it's got a fascinating history. In 1708, Isaac Norris, who is the namesake of Norristown, purchased the property, and his family owned it until 1864, which was during the time of the Civil War. By the 1870s, it became a boarding house, and then was occupied by engravers, watchmakers, and silversmiths. So you can see it's getting adaptive reuse. By the 1860s, it becomes home of a secondhand clothing shop, used furniture. There was an oyster saloon and a sign painter inside. But then the Norris family sold it in 1864 to a new owner with plans to demolish this historic building. It became a cause célèbre in the city for its preservation. And the Historical Society of Pennsylvania offered $30,000 to purchase the house, but then later withdrew the offer, unfortunately, and the house came down in 1867. The house was studied, sketched, and measured before demolition, so we would have accurate plans of it even after it was gone. A new building called the Commercial Exchange was built after it was demolished, but that burned down within a year of being completed. In 1870, the Keystone Telephone Company built a building that stood there until 1976, when that came down as part of the redo of Old City and Society Hill. And in 1982, the park you see in the lower right was created, called Welcome Park, designed by Venturi, Rauch, and Scott Brown, one of the leading architecture firms in Philadelphia in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. And that park is there today, and it honors the slate roof house with a small model that you can see in the lower right. Independence Hall was also subject to preservation activity. It was completed in 1748. In 1812, its original wings and arched plazas or piazzas were replaced by a row of brick buildings for city offices. But in 1813 and again in 1816, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania proposed selling off these buildings along with the square it sits on, because the capital by then had moved to Harrisburg. The state no longer needed it as their headquarters. So a cry went out to preserve Independence Hall, and the city of Philadelphia agreed to buy the building and the square, which was an important act for historic preservation in the early decades of the United States. In 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette, a hero of the American Revolution, visited America and stopped in Philadelphia. And in a speech, he used the term Independence Hall for the first time. And that name gained currency and remains attached to these buildings today. In 1828, the city council ordered a new steeple to resemble the original, which had rotted away 4 decades before. And that is more or less how the building looks to this day. Later, in the post-war era, the city's leaders became concerned over the decline of the commercial district around Independence Hall. And you can see in the early post-war years, circa 1948, how densely built up the area north of Independence Hall was, with banks, loft industrial buildings, factories, and other commercial structures. But this area had gone into decline during the Great Depression and then during World War II, and was seen as a danger to the historic buildings that were dotted throughout. So what did they do? They cleared the area around Independence Hall, you can see on the left, and began building a mall that we know today as Independence Mall, a 3-block area that would terminate in the view of Independence Hall. This was a very Roman idea that then city planning director Edmund Bacon was a big proponent of. And so here's Independence Mall in 1976 with all of the buildings gone. And the same idea spread throughout what became Society Hill, where large areas of the neighborhood were cleared for new construction, although they also restored historic buildings that dated from the early 1800s or before, and then allowed new buildings to be built in the open land around them, creating a neighborhood that to this day looks like a mix of historic and contemporary architecture, and that is Society Hill. But we lost some incredible buildings because of this project in the Society Hill and Independence Mall neighborhood. Anything that was built after about 1820 or so was targeted for demolition. And that included some amazing Frank Furness designed banks, Frank Furness being Philadelphia's leading late 19th century architect. And so the Guarantee Trust and Safe Deposit Company, which many people think of as the commercial companion to the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, which is my backdrop, came down, and it was demolished in 1957. Here's how it looked shortly before it was lost. We also lost another Frank Furness bank at 4th and Chestnut, built in 1879, and that was after the so-called period of significance for the Independence National Historic Park area, which was being created around the time this building was demolished by the federal government. So the national historic preservation movement was really sparked by the loss of Pennsylvania Station in New York, built by the Philadelphia-based Pennsylvania Railroad, a mighty colossus of an industrial company that was the largest industrial concern in the United States during its heyday. And they built this mammoth train station in the heart of Manhattan, along with tunnels connecting New Jersey to New York under the Hudson River. And it was completed in 1910. But a redevelopment plan in the 60s spelled the end of Penn Station, despite loud preservation concerns and protests to save this magnificent structure. And so that led to the creation of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, which created the National Register of Historic Places. It created National Historic Landmarks like Mary and Friends Meeting, and it created historic preservation offices in all 50 states in the United States. And this bill was championed by Lady Bird Johnson and was signed into law by President Johnson in 1966. Coming back to Philadelphia, the creation of the Preservation Act also coincided with an increasing appreciation for Philadelphia's magnificent 300 years of American architecture, and led to several successful battles to save landmarks in the city, including the Litt Brothers department store, which was built between 1859 and 1908, between 7th and 8th Streets on Market Street in Center City. It was really the combination of several narrow buildings that were combined together into one by the department store family. But the department store closed in 1977, and the building went vacant and began to deteriorate and was slated for demolition to be replaced by a surface parking lot. But a movement rose up to save Litz. This was in the pre-internet era when people expressed their opinion by mail and by phone, as well as by in-person protest. So this is an example of a Philadelphia Inquirer full-page ad that was taken by the Let Litz Live Coalition and the Preservation Coalition, which I had mentioned earlier as a predecessor to the Preservation Alliance. And the effort to save Litz was successful. It was almost demolished. The wrecking ball was on site when Mayor Good declared that the demolition should cease, and a development team came forward to convert the building into offices and retail space. And it was such big news that it even made the New York Times in 1986. And there on the right is a wonderful editorial from the Inquirer celebrating the preservation of the Litz building, which is still there today and still looms over Market East in a beautiful way. And here it is being restored in the 1980s. Across town, the United States Naval Home was a retirement home for naval personnel and sailors that was designed by prominent Philadelphia architect William Strickland and completed in 1833 in the Greek Revival style that was popular at that time. By 1976, the Navy decided to close the naval home, and it sat vacant for decades after that. A development plan finally came along in the 2000s after an arson fire badly damaged one of the buildings on the site, and the city sued the property owner, Toll Brothers, to force them to maintain the property, which was in desperate need of maintenance. And so the naval home was completed in 2007 as a residential community, which it is to this day. Moving on to the Victory Building at 10th and Chestnut Streets. This is a magnificent Second Empire Insurance Company headquarters, completed in 1875 and added on to in 1910, that by the 70s and 80s had fallen into terrible disrepair. I remember trees growing out. You can see in this photograph trees growing out of the cornice, windows boarded up. Vagrants had entered and started occasional fires inside, and it was a real eyesore. But in the 1990s, it was purchased by a developer and restored as apartments, which it serves as to this day. And then we had the Fairmount Waterworks, which is not only a National Historic Landmark, but is also a National Civil Engineering Landmark. It was built and opened in 1815 and added on to over the years, and supplied fresh water to Philadelphia's citizens by the use of a reservoir that was where the Philadelphia Museum of Art now stands. Water was pumped from these buildings out of the river up to the reservoir to serve the city. And as such, it was one of the first widespread municipal water systems in the country, providing clean, fresh water to the citizens of the city. But it closed in the early 20th century, fell into disrepair, and by the 1970s was an eyesore along the Schuylkill instead of the icon that it is today. But a fundraising effort led by the Junior League of Philadelphia finally restored the buildings by about 2003, and they remain today one of the iconic views of Philadelphia, and also includes an interpretive center for the water department to show how fresh water is created for city residents. It's an area to stroll and to take in its beauty, and there are occasional exhibits that take place there as well. And there's also a caterer who runs weddings and other private events there. So it is a beautiful part of our Fairmount Park today, after almost being lost to neglect and ruin. Over time, we also saw some reconstructions take place in the city. Preservationists often frown on reconstructing historic buildings that were lost, but in the Old City neighborhood, at least 2 buildings were reconstructed. The one on the left was reconstructed. It's the Declaration House. It's the building where Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. It was demolished in the late 19th century for a bank, but rebuilt in 1976 in time for the bicentennial. And on the right is City Tavern at 2nd and Walnut Streets in Old City. City Tavern was a very important meeting place for the founding fathers of this country to meet and debate and make policy and have a pint of beer or two. It was also lost in the 19th century, but reconstructed in 1976 for the bicentennial. Until recently, as many of you I'm sure know, it was in use as a restaurant, but that restaurant unfortunately closed in the last couple of years and the building is now vacant. Both of these are owned by the National Park Service. Philadelphia City Hall is another preservation triumph. It is the largest municipal building in the United States. It's also the tallest occupied building in the world, built between 1871 and 1901. In the 1950s, there was discussion of tearing it down, except for the tower topped by the statue of our Quaker founder, William Penn. But there was a fundraising effort in the 1980s to restore the tower and the statue, fueled in part by the sale of these lapel buttons for $1 a piece, which raised hundreds of thousands of dollars to restore City Hall Tower and William Penn. And the building itself was completely restored between the 90s and the early 2000s. It is now itself a proud symbol of the city of Philadelphia. But we've suffered some losses along the way as well, including the Boyd Theater, Philadelphia's last movie palace in our downtown, a downtown that used to have several impressive movie palaces. But when the last movie was shown in 2002, this beautiful Art Deco movie theater went vacant. And after much effort to try to find new uses for it, it was finally taken down in 2015, all except for the facade on Chestnut Street, which was preserved and will now form the entry portal to a new restaurant and hospitality use. So let's talk about what's going on today in historic preservation in Philadelphia. How does our city compare nationally? Well, we have the 3rd most total buildings of any city in the United States. We have the 2nd most buildings constructed before World War II. And we have the highest average number of building parcels per square mile of any city in the country. And that's a testament to how old a city this is and how quickly it grew in the horse and buggy era. There are about 500,000 buildings in the city of Philadelphia. Almost, or actually more than 2/3 of them were built before 1945. But only 4% of them are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and just over 2% are on the Philadelphia Register of Historic Places that I mentioned at the outset. And this compares unfavorably with our peer cities around the country. You can see on the left, the 50-city average of local designation is over 4%. We're only half of that. And national designation, 6.8%, but only 4.2% of the buildings in Philadelphia are so designated. The designations are concentrated in the central neighborhoods of the city, with scattered designations around other neighborhoods. And this is Philadelphia Register of Historic Places. On the one hand, it makes sense because the oldest parts of the city and the most significant historic buildings are in the old city and the downtown area. But this also reflects the fact that the histories of other people in the city, people of color, have historically been underplayed and overlooked. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we go forward. We also have invested less than our peer cities in historic preservation at the municipal level. Philadelphia has a historical commission staff of 8 and a budget of about $500,000, which compares unfavorably with peer cities like Baltimore, Chicago, Dallas, New Orleans, San Antonio, Phoenix even invests more in their historical agency than Philadelphia does. That is changing, however, but it has been the case for the past few decades. So the Preservation Alliance has been advocating with City Council and the Mayor for the past few years to increase funding for our Historical Commission, to create a citywide historical and cultural resources inventory, which is finally underway, to create more local historic districts, which is also happening, and to create other kinds of historic districts as well, to enact demolition review, which really is saying, let's evaluate buildings before they're demolished to establish if they've got historical value. That is not happening, at least not yet. And also to create a fund devoted to the restoration of historic buildings. Also still an ambition, not a reality. But we are making progress as a city. 25 new historic districts have been approved since 2017, including just this year, the Victorian Roxborough Historic District. 2 new staffers are being added to the Historical Commission, with, we hope, 2 more on the way. There have been some policy changes. The 10-year tax abatement, which has been very controversial, was scaled back starting last year, except for the rehabilitation of older buildings where the full tax abatement is still in place. And there have been new zoning incentives created for historic preservation that were enacted in 2020. And so it's beginning to pay off. This is hot off the press news. It was just revealed last week. This is a historic church in the Grays Ferry neighborhood that will be converted into 37 apartments rather than being demolished for new construction. And this project is taking advantage of the 10-year tax abatement, as well as the zoning incentives that went into effect in 2020. And we're seeing this happen not only here, but with other buildings around the city, including old factory buildings in Kensington and North Philadelphia that may have been demolished in the past, but now have incentives in place to save them, put them to new use. We have opportunities looking in the future to increase preservation activity in under-recognized neighborhoods, such as North Philadelphia, where the John Coltrane House is located, pictured in this image. We have an opportunity to support efforts to preserve historic housing as affordable housing in neighborhoods around the city. The Philadelphia Row House was created to be housing that is affordable to working class families. And it still serves that purpose today around the city. But there are so many vacant row houses that could be put back to use and preserved to house even more working families in neighborhoods all over Philadelphia. I talked about recognizing histories in under-recognized neighborhoods, and the Preservation Alliance has been very involved in this, including just this summer, getting approval for the Christian Street Black Doctors Row Historic District, which covers 6 blocks in South Philadelphia along Christian Street west of Broad, which for about a half a century in the 20th century housed families that were among the Black elite of Philadelphia. They were not just doctors, but they were lawyers, architects, engineers, prominent members of the clergy, prominent elected officials, who created this neighborhood that included social service agencies, churches, and fraternal organizations, and became known as Doctors Row. And so this historic district, which was approved in July, is the first historic district in Philadelphia to recognize or be based primarily on Black history. There's also an effort to recognize cultural resources, not just architectural, in neighborhoods around the city. And the city this year launched a cultural resources survey that will start in a pilot neighborhood, as yet to be identified. But this is an effort to broaden the definition of preservation beyond bricks and mortar to incorporate cultural aspects of the city as well. And we're on the verge of what may be the next preservation battle, which is the Philadelphia Police Headquarters down at 7th and Race, near Independence Mall, a building that was built in the early 1960s by Mayor Richardson Dilworth as a gesture towards openness and transparency in policing. He was a progressive mayor who was trying to reform city government, and he moved the police out of City Hall into this new building with the idea that the police would become a more open and welcoming part of the community. We know what happened in the subsequent decades. The police got a reputation for mistreatment of some of its citizens, including people of color, and were led for a number of years by Police Commissioner Frank Rizzo, who also went on to become mayor of the city and advocated a get tough policy that was especially tough on the city's Black and brown neighborhoods. And unfortunately, that legacy has become attached to this building, which is considered a significant work of modern architecture and engineering. The police moved out of this building just a few months ago. They moved into the former Inquirer building on North Broad Street. And so the future of this building is very much in question. And we are involved in an effort to find a new use for this building so that it does not fall to the wrecking ball, but remains not only part of the cityscape, but finds new uses that serve the people of the city and help heal the wounds that were created by the long-term police occupancy over the past 60 years. So with that, I will bring my talk to a close, the past, present, and future of historic preservation in Philadelphia. There's a lot more I could have talked about and might have talked about, but I know you all probably want to find out what the Eagles score is, and or get out and enjoy this beautiful day, although I see it's clouding over a bit as I speak. So I'll turn it back to Ross and Scott in case there are any questions for me.
Well, let me just say, most importantly, the score is 24-0. The Eagles are up.
Oh my goodness, wow. Go Birds.
Great. So we have, I guess, a few minutes for some questions. So if you want to post them in the chat, that's fine. If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, that's fine as well. One question, and I'll just sort of get this started. Once the Alliance has designated a property as historic, are there limitations? Does the Alliance set limitations on what the use of that property is? So for example, I was thinking about the Grays Ferry Church apartments. You said they're going to be converted to 37 apartments. Are those going to be luxury apartments? Are they affordable housing? Are they, how does the Alliance manage that process, and what's their role in that?
Good question. And really, it's kind of two questions wrapped up into one. First of all, the Preservation Alliance does not have the power to regulate property except properties where we have an easement. But otherwise, the power to regulate private property rests with the Philadelphia Historical Commission, which is the city agency I mentioned at the beginning. And if and when a property is added to the Philadelphia Register of Historic Places, they get to sign off on building permit applications for changes to the exterior of the buildings. However, they do not regulate use. The Historical Commission does not regulate use, so they cannot dictate whether apartments are affordable or market rate. They cannot dictate what kind of business goes into a building. There are aspects of the zoning code that do regulate use, but the Historical Commission does not get involved with that. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
And my understanding, Paul, is that in order to enhance preservation, that the exterior is what's focused on, and they don't want to dictate to people how a building is reused.
Right. They don't dictate how a building is reused. There is a provision, however, to designate interiors of buildings if the interior was originally intended to be accessible by the public. Now, there are only 5 such designations in the city. All of them were initiated by the Preservation Alliance. I'll just rattle them off real fast. The Family Court Building at 18th and Vine, which is the companion to the Free Library, you can all probably picture. Portions of the interior of that are designated and cannot be changed without Historical Commission approval. City Hall Council Chambers is protected. The interior of Macy's, formerly Wanamaker's Department Store, the Grand Court. The interior of 30th Street Station. And then just recently, we successfully nominated the interior of the former Jacob Reed's men's department store on the 1400 block of Chestnut Street, which was designed by architect Will Price and has tile murals from the Mercer Tile Works and murals by a female artist from the early 20th century whose name escapes me. But that is now also protected on the Historic Register. But interior designations are rare.
Right.
Yeah.
And is that Violet Oakley you're thinking of?
No, it's someone that she would have known, but I cannot think of her name.
Okay. So one of the questions I get often is because Marion Meeting is a National Historic Landmark, of which there are only roughly 2,600 in the entire country. Doesn't that mean that we get federal funding or federal support or other kind of funding? And no, it does not mean that.
No, unfortunately.
It's just, it means that, you need to preserve the exterior of the building. It's quite an honor. It helps you in writing other grants and getting other grants, but it does not provide any external funding in and of itself. And Paul, I have heard that a lot of the more historic buildings, the older buildings, are in the first and second ring suburbs of the city because the property values didn't jump as much as they did in the city. Have you heard anything along those lines?
Well, the inner ring suburbs include some of the older communities that were established, not long after Philadelphia was established. So they have some of the older buildings, that's for sure. And then since they've been around longer, they've been subject to designation for the National Register. Not every suburban community has the equivalent of Historical Commission, though. And so there are lots of historic buildings in the suburbs that are vulnerable to demolition or what we call insensitive alteration because there are no protections in place.
Thank you.
I got a question.
Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name's EJ Simpson. I mistakenly thought this meeting was going to be held at Marion Quaker. So I am here right now, and the rain is starting to pour. I'm enjoying the meeting very much. I've had a question. I'm trying to reach somebody here at the Marion to have a fundraising event, the possibility of having a fundraising event here. I've lived in Narberth off and on since I was about 10 years old. So if anybody knows who I could talk to about having a fundraising event here, please reach out to me. And otherwise that, I'm just happy to be listening to everything you've been saying, Paul. Thank you.
EJ, send an email to go
You
to
know
our
what, EJ,
website.
I have EJ's email.
Okay.
So
I've
we'll
done
make
that.
sure-
Yeah, great.
Okay.
We'll make sure you get connected with the right person.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Paul, I think we'll maybe make this the last question. And then, and this is, this often, I think, comes up when we start talking about these different designations, and there's, Philadelphia designations that are specific to Philadelphia. There's National Registry, National Historic Landmark. Is there, I guess, a hierarchy of historical designations, and are there others that are outside of Philadelphia that are, regionally based, or maybe it's just in Harrisburg? I think oftentimes we see a plaque on a building, and it's sometimes hard to sort of place where it sort of falls in the world of these different designations. So can you give us maybe a little primer on
Sure.
how these work?
Well, in Pennsylvania, there are only two kinds of historic designation, either local or federal. The state does not maintain a registry. The state does have a historic marker program, but just because you see a marker in front of a building or a site does not mean that that building or site is protected. That really falls to local designation. And Philadelphia, as a local government, does have a preservation ordinance that includes protections for historic properties. Some suburban communities also have that. Lower Merion Township, for example, has that. And that's where Marion Friends Meeting is, of course. But other communities do not have a local preservation ordinance. Most, in fact, do not. As I said, there's no state registry. At the federal level, there is the National Register, which includes National Register Historic Districts, National Register Sites, and National Historic Landmarks. But none of those designations confer any protections on a building. The federal government does not use its Federal Registry of Historic Properties to regulate property in any way. The only way that it comes in handy, well, two ways. Ross mentioned that it can make it easier to apply for grants because you've got that stamp of federal approval, essentially. It also enables developers to access federal historic tax credits, representing up to 20% of a project cost can be taken as a deduction on their income tax if the building is on the National Register and if the development complies with the federal government's rules for how the project is done. So that is a powerful tool to encourage the restoration and redevelopment of historic properties, and is used frequently all over the country. And I should say also, the state also has a tax credit program that operates similar to the federal, although it's much less generous.
Great.
And if you're a nonprofit, it doesn't help much.
It doesn't, no.
Right, but for developers, it's
Yes.
a big incentive to preserve
In fact,
it
it's-
rather than demolishing it.
It's confined only to income producing properties, that tax credit. So the Marion Friends Meeting really isn't an income producing property. Although EJ wants to give it some income, it sounds like.
Yes, indeed.
Well,
Paul,
thank
could
you. Yes, go ahead.
I want to see the John Coltrane house photograph again, but it doesn't have to be right now.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for your help, Scott, as always. Please look forward to our next talk in November. Please check out our website and for different activities that we have a very active first day school. If you have children, we have a potluck dinners, and we are a spiritual and religious community. So please come and visit us at Marian Friends Meeting at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings, or first day as we call it. We'd love to have you. And the building itself is unique, and our members are even more unique. So thank you again, Paul, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Ciao.